Gate. Built on the orders of King Edward I, as he required a safer, more usable entrance into the tower. So rather than travelling on those packed streets of London out there, where convoys could be attacked, stores stolen, or the prisoners set free, he decided to use the River Thames as a highway. So he had a hole knocked through this outer defensive wall, so that at high tide, boats could pass through the gate and unload their cargoes in safety. Therefore, this gate was originally known as the Watergate. Any Americans here today? Watergates, guys. We had ours first. And more importantly than that, our Watergate down there is over 600 years old, and we're pretty sure it doesn't leak as much as your Watergate did. So I said it was known as the Watergate. How then did it become known as Traitors' Gate? Well, this occurred during the Tudor period, due to the large number of alleged traitors to enter this mighty fortress through those grim gates. Amongst them, no less than 4 Queens of England. Queen Anne Boleyn, Queen Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, the uncrowned Queen of only 9 days, and Princess Elizabeth Tudor, later Queen Elizabeth I. Of those 4 queens, 3 would be executed and 1 would survive. High dignitaries of the church were no exception. Archbishop Cranmer, Bishops Latimer and Ridley were brought into the tower during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor. And these 3 religious men were later taken off to Oxford and burnt at the stake for heresy. Those and many more unfortunate souls would have travelled down the River Thames from their trials at London's Guildhall or the Palace of Westminster. Passed through those gates, landed at those steps to be met by the yeoman jailer with his axe and an escort of yeoman warders. They would then be taken through the Bloody Tower archway just behind you there to the cells to await whatever fate had in store. Unfortunately, for most of these people, or for many of these people, it was just going to be a short journey back out of the tower to their place of execution. Right, on that cheerful note, I did mention the Bloody Tower, didn't I? Well, there it is, look, straight above that archway. Now, if you look up, you see those 2 staggered windows? That's the Bloody Tower. You can go in and visit if you want, and if you go in there, you're going to learn a little bit more about a real character called Sir Walter Raleigh. Have you heard of him? Yeah? No? If you haven't, don't panic. He was around during the time of Queen Elizabeth I. He was a navigator, an explorer, a pirate. He was robbing the Spanish on the high seas and quietly passing that money back to Queen Elizabeth I. He was a great favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. He was a statesman in Parliament, a historian. He brought us potatoes and tobacco back from the New World, so a very busy man. But most of all, he was a character, in and out of trouble all his life. And that managed to earn him 13 years of his life imprisoned up there in the Bloody Tower. And they decided to make his life a misery for pretty much all of those 13 years. They locked him in there with his wife. There are many ways to break a man, guys. 13 years, 3 different stints up there with his wife and kids. No Wi-Fi. As it turned out, though, Sir Walter Raleigh's wife loved him dearly, but his luck was going to run out. In 1618, King James I didn't like him, had him executed. After they cut his head off, they presented it back to his wife. She couldn't bear to be parted with it, so she boiled it, preserved it, put it in a velvet sack, and carried it with her wherever she went for 29 years. Ladies, imagine the dilemma. You're getting ready, you're going out with the girls. Head or handbag? Anyone for the head? Good, okay. Right, moving on rapidly. If you follow this wall down now, you'll come to a big tower on the end there with the white box on the top. Can you all see that? Yeah. Okay, that one's called the bell tower. So named because inside that box it contains a bell. The oldest surviving curfew and alarm bell in London. When sounded an alarm, that would have been the signal for all the gates to be closed, drop gates lowered, and these battlements to be manned in defence. Inside the bell tower are just 2 circular prison chambers. And we know we've had some very famous prisoners inside those 2 cells. The man for all seasons, Sir Thomas More, one-time Lord Chancellor of England, was held in the lower chamber for refusing to accept King Henry VIII as head of the Church of England. At the same time, and for the same reason, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was held in the upper chamber known as the Strong Room. Well, both of these men were to suffer terribly, but they couldn't be persuaded to change their religious beliefs, and finally were taken out onto Tower Hill for public beheading. 400 years later, in 1935, both of those men were canonised as saints of the Roman Catholic faith in recognition for their suffering in there. Now, another famous prisoner to be held up there in the Strong Room was the young Princess Elizabeth Tudor. Her half-sister, Queen Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, had reason to believe Elizabeth was implicated in the Sir Thomas Wyatt rebellion against the Queen's plans to marry Philip of Spain. Well, fortunately, Elizabeth was proven innocent and banished for a time to Woodstock Palace. But after a brief space of just 4 years, Elizabeth was to return to the Tower to prepare for her own coronation. And this would turn out to be one of her last visits here to the Tower of London during her long reign of nearly 45 years. Basically, Elizabeth, so I'm talking about Queen Elizabeth I now, was petrified of the Tower of London. After all, her mother, Queen Anne Boleyn, was executed here on Tower Green. She spent time up there in that bell tower thinking that she was going to go the same way. As it turned out, though, she held off the Scottish, she held off the French, and she sank the Spanish Armada. All those ships coming to invade England. Effectively, she bankrupted Spain overnight and removed what was at the time a massive problem. So I think she turned out to be one of our very best queens after all. Right. Who else was up there? I'll make this the last one. Okay, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, eldest of 13 children of King Charles II. Now, I do like to point out at this stage that King Charles II had an interesting nickname. He was nicknamed the Merry Monarch because of those at least 13 kids, none of them came from his wife. Okay? He was out there working very hard to earn that nickname. Anyway, after the death of his father in 1685, this handsome and popular young man was persuaded to stake his claim to the throne by virtue of his uncle, King James II, being a known Roman Catholic. Well, to press home his claim, he landed in the West Country of England and marched inland, gathering what is known as popular Protestant support in what is now known as the Monmouth Rebellion. Well, that revolt was crushed at the Battle of Sedgemoor on the 6th of July, 1685. But the leader, James Scott, managed to escape the battlefield and evade capture for about a week, until they found him hiding in a ditch. Condemned to death in his absence, there was no need for a trial. And so 3 days later, he was taken from the bell tower up onto Tower Hill. Now, this would turn out to be one of the bloodiest executions ever to take place in English history. The notorious executioner, Jack Ketch, a man well over 6 feet tall, was going to be doing the job. And Jack Ketch was a part-time butcher. He was a part-time executioner, but he was a full-time drunk. This never was going to go very well, oh no. And on the day in question, he brought all of those skills together. He turned up on the day with the wrong style axe, which was blunt. Well, James Scott did the only thing that he could do in a situation like this, and he paid his executioner 6 guineas and challenged him to do a good job. Not like you did to my Lord Russell, a notorious execution that Jack Ketch had messed up the time before. In fact, he messed it up so badly, he was forced to write an explanation about it in the broadsheet newspapers of London to explain himself. Well, I don't know if it's a good idea to torment or even unnerve your executioner before he attempts to take your head off in front of a large crowd. Because, as the story goes, after the first blow of the axe, James Scott actually jumped up from the block, holding the top of his head, which now had a bit missing out of it, in agony, and once again challenged his executioner to do a good job. Or words to that effect. Anyway, back down on the block he went. But after 2 or 3 more blows of that axe, still with a grunting and groaning James Scott, Jack Ketch the executioner actually gave up. He threw down his axe and declared, "I cannot continue. My heart's not in it." Well, the sheriffs of London up there on Tower Hill said, "You better pick up that axe and do it quickly for all our sakes." There were thousands of people up on that hill watching this execution, and none of them wanted to see that handsome man being butchered in the way that he was. So Jack Ketch did as he was told. He picked up the axe and he continued. But after another blow or 2 of the axe, Jack Ketch gave up again. He threw down the axe, he took out his butcher's carving knife, and he finally silenced James Scott, completing the task with that. Not a good way to go, I think you would all agree. But that's not the interesting part of this story. The interesting bit is we then brought both his head and body back into the tower. It was sewn together once more, and then he was buried inside the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula about 24 hours later. Why did we do that? You must be thinking. Well, it sort of made sense, but perhaps just a little bit late in the day, they had realised this eldest son of a king, they never had his portrait. Get the head, get the body, sewed it back together, and they painted his portrait. Wrong on all sorts of levels, I think you would agree. Now, you can go and see that portrait if you want. Go down to the National Portrait Gallery, Trafalgar Square, free to get in. And when you're walking around in there, I think you'll find you're looking for the portrait where he's lacking a bit of colour in his cheeks. Okay. Right, enough of this. Make a big gap.